have, I'll take the layout, make it as grid. Shall we, Father, with your permission?
Please.
Yeah. All right. Very good evening to all. I hope all are keeping safe. Our prayers for your safety and well-being. On behalf of the Department of International Studies, Political Science and History, Christ University, and Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University, a hearty welcome to the International Conference on Shared Worldviews and US-India Relations in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Despite the crisis, we have decided to move ahead with the event because it is crucial that we discuss it and pressing issues of the time. We are glad and appreciate the overwhelming participation, both on the resource persons and at the participants level. During the proceedings, please note the following. Participants are kindly requested to keep their mics muted. You're most welcome to send your questions through either chat or Q&A options that are available to you. Our volunteers will curate them for responses from the panelists. Please identify yourself and also who the question is directed to. You're kindly requested to fill in a short feedback form, the link to which will be posted in the chat box during Q&A. We will also email you the same. Please turn them in. The survey is to take forward the initiative and the responses will be kept confidential. As mentioned, participation certificate will be issued on request along with the feedback form. With that initial note, I am glad to invite Dr. Deepa Ollapally, the moderator of the conference, to take over the proceedings. Just to briefly introduce Dr. Deepa, Dr. Deepa Ollapally is the Director, Rising Powers Initiative and Research Professor, Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. She is a political scientist specializing in Indian foreign policy, India-China relations, and Indo-Pacific regional and maritime security. Over to you, Professor Deepa.
Thank you so much, Professor Manohar. Good evening to everyone in India and good day to everyone else that has joined us from around the world. I'm deeply honored and delighted to welcome you all to this conference on behalf of the Rising Powers Initiative at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. And I'm so proud to collaborate with Christ University on this initiative of looking at shared world views and US-India relations in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Now, we happen to be meeting at a moment of unprecedented national crisis in India with this furious second wave of COVID, and I know that many of you are facing enormous personal difficulties, just like many of my own family and friends in Bangalore and elsewhere. So let me just give my heartfelt thanks to all of you for taking the time and effort to join us today. We have a large group of students and young professionals in the audience today, several hundreds of them, especially from around South India. And this is exactly what we had hoped for, since one of the goals of this George Washington Christ Initiative is to bring more foreign policy expertise to a rising younger demographic that is not so Delhi-centric, Delhi-centered. And indeed, this extraordinary moment of challenge, as Professor Manohar said, is actually perhaps the right time to gather together and discuss and debate issues as we're going to do. And I think it's really in the interest of the young minds to do so. I'm happy to say that you can look forward to an exciting program, hearing from several leading US foreign policy experts who also know India, offering their views on Indo-US cooperation, where they think relations are headed. And what I'm going to do is I will introduce each of them just before their turn to speak. Well, as I sort of kick off this conference, I thought I'd make three rather broad points as introductory comments on current US-India relations. First of all, it's almost exactly 100 days into the Biden administration. And I think we all thought initially that his attention would be mostly domestic and probably very inward looking. But I think the reality has been quite different. Biden has been an activist president. The number of tweets, of course, has gone down, but I think the number of policies have gone up. And what's more, in foreign policy, the theme of our conference, the Indo-Pacific, has turned out to be at the front and center of US foreign policy priority right now. Number two, I want to point out that the term Indo-Pacific and its promotion originated during the Obama-Biden era. Now you can ask, what's in a name? In this case, a lot, as we will see. Nothing short of a historic correction of the term Asia-Pacific, which covered East Asia, and then effectively stopped at the Bay of Bengal. And the last point I want to make is that the Indo-Pacific narrative or idea is now being translated into more tangible outcomes for the Indo-US partnership. One big question is what that is going to look like and how far it will go. An important assumption is that it can be comprehensive because the two countries share not only defense and economic interests, but arguably also deeper values. Well, we'll see what the panelists and the speakers have to say on all of this. I could say much more, but I'm going to leave it at that. I will be commenting and raising questions for the speakers as we move along, and we will, of course, have time at the end for audience Q&A. Well, now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Father Jose, who is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor as well as a professor of international studies, political science, and history at Christ University. I have to tell you, I'm afraid I won't have enough time to do justice to each of the speakers' long and distinguished backgrounds, but their bios are available on our websites. Dr. Father Jose is a noted expert on maritime history and is a prolific author with many publications, including 4 books. He's also well-versed in theology and philosophy and holds a PhD in history from Pondicherry University. Let me take this opportunity to make a special thanks to my Christ colleagues and the leadership of Father Jose for their truly heroic efforts to carry this conference forward for the sake of the students, despite the mounting challenges. When I visited the campus 3 years ago, those faraway days, the thing that really struck me was the amazing energy of the students and faculty. And then I met Father Jose, and I quickly realized that he was the driving force behind this incredible university that is going from strength to strength and soaring ahead. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Father Jose, for your keynote welcome remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Deepa, for those kind words. Dr. Alyssa Ayres, Dr. Deepa Ollapally, Dr. Daniel Twining, Dr. Joshua White, Dr. Richard M. Rosso, Dr. Madhumati, Dr. Manoharan, Dr. Vageshwari, my colleagues at Christ University and other partner institutions, my dear students and scholars at Christ University and other institutions, good evening and good morning to those who are in United States. We are glad to collaborate with Sigurd Center for Asian Studies, Elliott School of International Affairs, and US Department of State on this important project, share worldviews and US-India relations in the Indo-Pacific and beyond that has got immense contemporary relevance. At this juncture, I'm glad to acknowledge and appreciate the great efforts of Dr. Professor Deepa Ollapally in effectively initiating and taking the project forward. And special thanks also to the efforts taken up by Dr. Madhumari and Dr. Manoharan. This is one of the key several collaborative projects that the Department of International Studies, Political Science and History of Christ University is involved. We are consciously working on training our students in both theoretical and practical aspects of international studies that is constantly reflected in their publications and placements. We at the department and the university strongly believe in the value and role of higher education in shaping young minds and in establishing peace and harmony in the world at large. It is unfortunate that this initial meeting has to take place on virtual mode due to the pandemic. But I pray that the next round of discussions and presentations happen at our Bangalore campus. We are more than happier to do our best in making this project a success. As outlined in the concept note, the conference identifies two key questions. Number one, how are relations between India and the United States, largest and oldest democracies, evolving for a post-pandemic era in the Indo-Pacific region? Number two, what does the first 100 years of Biden administration tell us? I'm glad that we have some wonderful speakers on the panel to deliberate on these and several other questions on US-India relations today. I agree with the Indian Prime Minister when he observed the India-US partnership is based on shared values. We have substantial and multifaceted bilateral agenda, growing economic engagement and vibrant people-to-people linkages. Both India and the US are vibrant democracies. We both stand for upholding democratic ideals at the global level as well. We both have been mutually reinforcing each other, especially in addressing security threats, traditional and non-traditional. Cooperation in the cyberspace is gathering momentum. Securing sea lanes of communication for safe energy and trade routes in the Indo-Pacific region is yet another common ground. Both are multicultural societies with civilizational strength backing us. Indian-American community is a sample of representation of confluence of values between the two countries. I'm proud to note that India is a land of opportunity in every sense, not just now, but since the ages. It will continue to be. I do hope this conference will explore such opportunities. In the process of our aspiration to be self-reliant world power, we need reliable and strong partners. Who else can we look for other than the United States of America? With this short note, I wish the conference the very best and do hope that this is the beginning of a long journey of partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Jose, for those inspirational words and suggestions for some concrete action as well. I should note that I too am looking forward from GW to carry forward this initiative and having several more events down the road that we will hope that we will be announcing to the audiences as things improve. And let me now turn to the next agenda item. And I have to say that I have to make a small change to the agenda that you have. The next speaker was supposed to be Brian Heath, who's the acting deputy chief of mission at the U.S. mission in New Delhi. But he has been overtaken by events, as you can imagine, and having to oversee some of the transfer of resources that are suddenly appearing from the United States and the huge endeavor they're involved in. However, I'm very happy to announce that his boss, Dan Heflin, who's the chargé d'affaires himself, who's the senior most official at the U.S. mission to India in New Delhi, has sent a message to the conference today, which I'm going to now read out to the audience now. So this is from Don Heflin, the chargé d'affaires of the United States. I want to thank George Washington University and Christ, deemed to be university in Bengaluru, for hosting this important virtual conference on U.S.-India relations in the Indo-Pacific. These are challenging times. We stand in solidarity with our Indian friends and partners as you battle this pandemic. We are rapidly deploying critical assistance to India, including supplies of therapeutics, rapid diagnostic test kits, ventilators, personal protective equipment, and the raw materials India needs to continue producing vaccines for its people at home and around the world. We are working nonstop to identify ways to deliver additional urgent supplies to India, including oxygen assistance. When President Biden spoke with Prime Minister Modi earlier this week, he pledged America's full support, and America's full support is what India will receive. This support extends beyond the U.S. government to the expertise and capabilities of the U.S. private sector, as evidenced by the Secretary of State Blinken's virtual meeting with the U.S.-India Business Council and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as well as the recent announcements of support made by U.S. companies. Supplies are on the way, with the first support flight expected tomorrow. U.S. assistance includes an initial delivery of 1,100 oxygen cylinders, 1,700 oxygen concentrators, a number of oxygen generation units, 1 million rapid diagnostic test kits, and more support is on the way, including 20,000 treatment courses of the antiviral drug remdesivir. Other countries are similarly extending offers of assistance. This assistance will help the Indian people as we also work together to ensure that the Quad countries, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, meet our joint pledge to deliver up to 1 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses by the end of 2022. The Quad's vaccine initiative aims to assist countries in the Indo-Pacific with vaccination and will reach over 1/7 of the world's population. We are in this together, and together we will overcome this crisis. So some breaking news from the Chief of Mission, Don Heflin. All right, and now back to the people on hand here. And I'm now delighted to introduce the Dean of my school, the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington, Dr. Alyssa Ayres. She's here not just as the head of the school, but as one of the world's leading authorities on India and South Asia. Her book about India's rise on the world stage, Our Time Has Come, How India is Making Its Place in the World, was selected by the Financial Times for its summer 2018 politics reading list. High praise indeed. Before coming to GW just this year, Alyssa was Senior Fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she remains an Adjunct Senior Fellow. And prior to that, she served in the government as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia under President Obama. She holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. And for me personally, given her specialty and background on US-India relations, Alyssa is the dream dean. And I have asked her to be a sort of scene setter for the conference. And I now invite Dr. Ayres to offer her commentary on India and the US in a more multipolar world. Over to you, Alyssa.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone. I want to say a special thanks to Professor Deepa Ollapally for her energy and the vision to convene this gathering. Thanks as well, of course, to Pro-Vice-Chancellor Father Joes, and of course to the U.S. Department of State. So for me personally, what a pleasure to have the Elliott School's Seeger Center for Asian Studies and its Rising Powers Initiative partnering on this dialogue. It's also nice to join old friends in this discussion today. We don't get to see each other the way we would have done so more regularly in the before times, and I hope we can get back to that in the months ahead. Like others, I'm mindful that as we gather together today, the COVID-19 crisis in India has continued to intensify. So let me also offer my condolences to all who have lost loved ones or otherwise suffered in these trying times. We're thinking about you in the United States. Now, when Professor Ollapally asked if I would be able to join you today in thinking about shared worldviews in the US-India relationship, it got me reflecting a little bit on the idea of what worldviews India and the United States share and how we as institutions of higher education play an important role in the relationship. I think it is by now well acknowledged, at least for our participants today, that India and the United States have come a long way together in the past 2 decades. You can see that in the growth of the formal diplomatic relationship, one that we now describe as a strategic partnership. That term itself is actually relatively new and dates only to about a decade back. Our bilateral collaboration encompasses a huge range of pursuits. It's deeper diplomatic consultation, it's defense cooperation, public health, commerce and trade, space, science and technology, weather and meteorology, clean energy and climate, higher education. All of this underscores that today a whole universe of cooperation takes place. We'll talk later today about our defense cooperation. The US and Indian militaries exercise together regularly. That's something that few would have imagined 3 decades ago, but has become a strong pillar of the partnership. India is now a major defense partner of the United States, and that's a status that places it on par with US allies in terms of defense technology cooperation. And we're both proponents of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and this broadly shared vision has paved the way for our participation together in the Quad consultation along with Australia and Japan. And of course, as others have mentioned, the Indian American community is a big part of the US and India story. Indian Americans now number around 4 million strong and are leaders in the United States at the highest levels of so many sectors, whether it's academia or journalism, tech, medicine, the nonprofit sector, and of course, we've seen in politics as well. So you can see the growth and change and most of all, the energy in the US-India relationship across every field. But, and I want to be a little bit provocative here to help frame our discussion, I think we do not necessarily see absolutely every single issue in the same way. That doesn't mean we aren't closer now than ever in the past. That's certainly the case. But it does mean that we do not always approach questions with the same assumptions. So I would suggest that one of these areas of some divergence that's worth exploring is in our perceptions of global geopolitics. In India, strategic thinkers are pretty firmly of the view and have been for some time, as I wrote in my book, that the world has evolved to a much more multipolar order, one that favors the rise of Indian power as one among several global powers. In my experience, this is not entirely the way US strategic thinkers view the world and the way our countries are situated within it. I think this is still a process, something undergoing revision for practitioners. And here I'm concerned with practitioners, not theorists. Practitioners who have had many decades in which to practice foreign policy in a world that either had two blocks or a world in which the United States enjoyed a superpower dominance. The United States has very strong alliance relationships across the Atlantic with our European partners and strong alliance relationships in the Asia-Pacific. These date to the middle of the 20th century, and we've had decades to hone our processes of consultation and cooperation together. Now, things are different with India. India is not an ally, has not suggested any interest in playing such a role. As I said, India does see itself as a global power in an increasingly multipolar world. Washington has, in more recent years, developed greater sensitivity to this nuance, but because we don't have that decades of history of longstanding consultation together, a history of a regular diplomatic calendar going back 50 years, for example, as we have with our very close alliance partners, I believe it's always a little bit more difficult to get India on the foreign policy front burner. This is my personal view, of course. Others may differ. I look forward to disagreement on this question, but trying to change this dynamic has been a focus of both my scholarship and my time as a practitioner. I would also add, and I don't think it'll be any surprise to all in our discussion today, that detailed discussion about democratic values as part of our shared worldviews themselves are not easy ones between Washington and New Delhi. New Delhi has, as long as I can remember, and I wrote about this in my book, New Delhi has objected to external comment on its domestic affairs. And frankly, this is a position that very often people outside government share. Why should the United States comment when the US has so many problems of its own? To this, I would add that we in the United States certainly do have many challenges of our own domestically, and those have been on full display for the world recently. I've always believed, and I've testified before Congress to this effect, that we are best positioned when we offer a powerful example. And it is obvious that we have work to do on the democratic values front to live up to our own ideals. I also believe that we can and should be open about this in discussions in the same way that I believe we should be able to talk diplomatically about concerns in India. That's what open democracies should be able to do together. India has, on a series of objective third-party metrics, received criticism, most especially over the past 2 years, over concerns relating to the health of democratic institutions, individual freedoms, freedom of the press, religious freedoms, and steps the Indian government has taken in Kashmir that have denied liberties preemptively to individuals. If we care about the future of democracy in the world, we should certainly care about its health in India. I'd like to offer one further thought to the framing of our conversation today on the question of shared worldviews. And this is something that some of you may have heard me say at different times because I believe it's so important. Despite the much closer relationship India and the United States have developed in recent years, we have some asymmetries in a formative area that we should further develop, and that is the arena of cultural and academic exchange. And here, specifically, I mean the challenge of educating Americans about contemporary India. Increasing the pipeline of those with a commitment to and an understanding of this relationship on both sides can, in the long run, help further all aspects of US-India ties and further enhance shared worldviews. So we ought to be investing in cohort development. The numbers here are just not where you might think they'd be. There are few long-term indicators to examine this question, so I'll rely on some study abroad data from the Institute for International Education as a proxy to help provide a general trajectory. Now, more than 20 years ago, US study abroad students in India could be counted in the hundreds. I was one of them back in 1990 and 91. During the 1995-96 school year, for example, only 470 US students studied in India. A decade later, that number had more than quadrupled to a little more than 2,000. By 2016-2017, that number had more than doubled again to over 4,700. But in 2017-2018, it dipped down to just below 4,000. And for the most recent year available, 2018-2019, it was at 3,366. Now, clearly the long term shows improvement from the past. There's no question about that. Yet when we put it in comparative context, this all looks like we could be doing more on our end in the United States. In fact, fewer American students head to India than head to South Africa, Denmark, South Korea, New Zealand, Netherlands, Peru, Ecuador, or Israel. Those are all just above India in terms of US students studying abroad. Almost 2.5 times as many US students head to Costa Rica for a study abroad experience than to India. I'm going to share a slide with everyone to give you a visual representation of this data. So just give me one moment as I do this. We did this in the practice session and it worked then. So can you all see? I know it's a little blurry. I apologize for that. You can see from the slide what these flows really look like here. So from my perspective, the fact that India attracts less than half the number of American students than tiny Costa Rica, which is a beautiful country and a destination particularly to study climate change and environmental issues. But I think this comparison gives us pause. It speaks to whether some places are more top of mind than others. China receives almost 3.5 times as many US students as India does. The UK sees more than a 10x difference, and it also turns out that India as a destination for US study abroad has fallen in the ranks as other destinations have risen in recent years. India has dropped from number 13 in 2014-2015 to number 15 in the academic year 2015-2016. I'm going to switch slides now. One more. Over time, here we go. Yeah, India was number 15 in the year 2015-2016, fell to number 17 in the academic year 2017 and 2018, and has dropped to the number 22 destination for US study abroad in the academic year 2018 to 2019. So this chart here shows a comparison with just a few top destinations over time. Again, all these details are available on the Institute for International Education's website, but I think this graphic just really gives you a sense of the distance we have to travel and the work we have to do here in the United States. I'm going to close this one. Great. So let me note too that I am much less worried about building exposure to the United States among Indian citizens because these channels are already really quite well established. For 20 years, India has been either the #1 or the #2 sending country for international students in the United States, with more than 100,000 students each year since 2007, crossing more than 200,000 annually in the year 2012. Unemployment. We all know that Indian citizens receive the lion's share of approved petitions for high-skilled work visas. So we really need to increase the exposure US citizens of all backgrounds have to the aspirations, concerns, and continued challenges of today's India. Just by way of wrapping this up, India is now enormously important to the global economy, to global peace and security, and to global governance. As we can see right now with the catastrophic spread of COVID-19 in India, we cannot beat this pandemic in the world if we cannot beat it in India. India is a place of great history and one that is currently facing vexing challenges at home as well as abroad. So to better prepare US citizens for a world in which India plays this much larger role, we all need to be more aware of and attentive to developments in the world's largest democracy. That, in my view, will be essential to advancing shared worldviews. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the further discussions today.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, for that compelling argument for the need of greater, people-to-people engagement, student engagement, and so forth. And I'm happy that we are doing a very small part in promoting exactly that agenda item. Now, if I could just take just a couple of seconds to probe a question for you to answer. You pointed out the divergence is in the conceptions of geopolitics, and that there exists to some extent in the multipolar world versus what the United States' preferences are, perhaps. But at the same time, for India to play a global role in a multipolar world, which is perhaps a little bit more equally distributed in terms of power and influence, it cannot do it on its own. So I think that is also something that has been something the Indian strategists have also come to realize. And so my question to you is, how can the United States' continued dominance and power be leveraged by India for its continued rise, even in a multipolar world, despite the divergence? I mean, if you had to sort of give...
I think that question, I think, is for Indian strategists to answer. Let me take that in another way. To me, I think one of the central challenges in global governance is the fact that India does not find itself having representation that many Indian thinkers believe that it would be appropriate at this point. We have institutions of global governance that were created in the 20th century that do not include India as among a member. So the most obvious of these is the UN Security Council. There are other countries in the world that really share this complaint about the way the Security Council has not evolved over time to incorporate the changing nature of global power dynamics in the world. And the United States has, during the Barack Obama administration, declared its support for Indian membership in a reformed and expanded UN Security Council. Now, I think we all are aware that there has not been any traction on reform and expansion of the Security Council in all these years. That is a real challenge. We could make the same argument I have argued about the importance of the Indian economy and the challenge that India is not a member of APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. You have one of the largest economies in Asia that is not part of this organization that is dedicated to expanding trade and investment across the region. You would think would be an important move to engage India. It is now one of the world's largest economies. The size of its economy in GDP terms, right, not in per capita terms, places it essentially on par, hovering in a band with the UK and with France. It is also the case that on a per capita basis, India is hovering around $2,000 annually. But China also has been a country that has seen its economy expand to be either the largest or the second largest, depending on what metric you use in the world, while being at this point a middle income country with a per capita income of around $9,000, $10,000 a year. So we now have two very large economies in the world that on a per capita basis are not wealthy. Is that a reason not to include India in global governance, in conversations about trade and investment, about international security? I've made the same argument about the G7 and the need to consider what the G7 should look like. Is it an organization that should be agenda setting only for more prosperous economies in the world? I think these are real and important questions that US foreign policy makers should preoccupy themselves with, because it is a question of how do we engage and understand the aspirations, the priorities, the perceptions of the way the world is evolving, and how we can cooperate on the challenges that we all face together. I've argued for years and years that I think we should be more expansive in helping India achieve that seat at the table.
Yes, thank you so much. There are certain gaps in India's power and position on the globe that I think clearly the United States can facilitate. So thank you for your comments, Alyssa, and we could go on, but in the interest of time, I'm going to thank you and move on to the panel now. So thank you very much. And now to the panelists who are going to take us through several different aspects of the US-India relations. Alyssa has laid out a number of these worldviews, defense, economics. That's exactly what we're going to do in the next 45 minutes or so. And we're starting with perhaps the most intangible of these, with the shared values and why they matter. When I looked for a leading expert on this admittedly difficult topic, as the Dean just mentioned as well, I knew not to look any further than Dan Twining. Dan is the president of the International Republic Institute, based in Washington, D.C., and where he leads a team of over 700 global experts. Previously, he was counselor to the president and director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Dan has also served as a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's policy planning staff, been a foreign policy advisor to U.S. Senator John McCain, and as a staff member of the U.S. Trade Representative. He has taught at Georgetown and has been a columnist for a variety of well-known outlets, including Foreign Policy and Nikkei. He holds a PhD from, I should say a DPhil to be exact, from Oxford University. And he really has been a tireless and persistent advocate for the importance of democratic values in international affairs. It's I'm always amazed that Dan has continually kept up with this. And so I'm just delighted that he's joining me today. And so Dan, why do values matter in US-India partnership, or why should they matter?
Thanks, Deepa. Thanks. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. You know, I've long admired your work. My old yet young friend, Alyssa Ayres, we worked on South Asia together in the Bush administration, how far that bilateral US-India relationship has come. Josh White, who I've learned so much from, and our Indian colleagues. You know, I will confide, Deepa, that in this strange last year of no travel, the country I've missed going to most is India, by a factor of 4 or 5. And of course, we're all praying for India's swift recovery from this terrible pandemic. I think all of us who know India and Indians know how resilient they are and how they will build back better out of this very difficult humanitarian situation that India is in. The United States was in a terrible situation last year. So our solidarity is 100% with you as you work through this in your country. So Deepa, I would just like to make 5 quick points, and I'll do them pretty rapidly here because I know we have a lot of ground to cover. But the first is just to flag really how the Cold War geopolitical prism really distorted and artificially constrained the relationship between the world's 2 biggest democracies. I mean, it is a bit unusual that in a contest between the free world and the Soviet Empire, that the US and India enjoyed, you know, a complicated relationship during that period for lots of reasons. But I think the fundamental point is that that artificial constraint disappeared over the last 20 to 30 years. And that has enabled really an explosion of collaboration at all levels, from people to people to the highest levels of strategy between our free and open societies. And so I think the great mission of the 21st century, frankly, is to cement this relationship, that this US-India partnership is really perhaps the most important relationship in the world in terms of the future of the Indo-Pacific. And of course, the nature of the Indo-Pacific as the cockpit of wealth and power in the 21st century will determine the nature of the international order. And India and the United States as free and open societies have so much at stake in getting this right. So that's just a quick point 1. Point 2 is I would like to say, as we think about great power competition and the dynamics, that of course there are hard security and interest-based considerations at play. We don't need to tell India that. It shares the world's longest contested border with a predatory and revisionist neighbor and has been through several very tense military standoffs with China just over the past year. So Indians need no lessons from the United States in that dynamic. But I think more fundamentally, and you know, President Biden talked about this last night here in the United States, that there is a contest underway around what's the best way to organize a society in this era of rapid technology and economic diffusion and multipolarity, as Alyssa suggested. What's the best approach? India, the US, other free and open countries offer a certain model, actually variations within a model, which is fundamentally of an open society that trusts in people, that invests in responsive politics, that relies on accountable institutions and electoral integrity and free and independent media and all of these things. China, among others, represents a very different model, and I'll come back to that. But really, there is a competition underway around what is the best way to achieve human aspirations of prosperity, of dignity, of having a voice, of feeling included, of knowing that there's a better future in store for your children and grandchildren. How we handle technology is also a very fundamental question. Will the technology internet revolution, the digital revolution that is very much underway and accelerating, will that produce total surveillance and forms of state control that George Orwell could only dream of? Or will that technology diffuse to empower citizens, to allow governments to be more responsive to them, to really drive outcomes that enhance broad-based prosperity? How are we going to handle climate and the energy revolution? You know, are we going to trust in state-run giants controlled by a Communist Party cell and answerable to a political leader? Is that the solution to the world's climate conundrum and the kind of clean energy that India and the United States and many countries desperately need? Are we going to trust alternatively in free and open educational systems, our very dynamic and innovative private sectors? Are we going to basically assume a different model between state and society in terms of what can produce effective environmental outcomes? And then what kind of world are we going to live in? I mean, this is a fundamental question. Are disputes going to be settled by force, by might makes right, by who the strongest power is? I mean, you've seen some of that already in the South China Sea. That's not a world that India or the United States would prefer to live in. India and the United States would prefer to live in a world in which a free and open international system is a reflection of free and open societies in it. And that means peaceful settlement of disputes. That means provision of public goods like freedom of the seas, an open internet, an open digital architecture, disputes that are not settled through conflict, a world that relies on institutions and stronger forms of multilateralism. So we do have a lot at stake here. Point three, I mean, just very briefly, a world dominated by the Chinese Communist Party, to take the most obvious counterexample, would be just hugely inimical to our societies. Let's look at what the Chinese are doing to their own people in Xinjiang, what the Chinese system is doing to its own people in Hong Kong. Let's look at the fact that repression at home too often equates to aggression abroad, as we're seeing in terms of China's very aggressive behavior towards India, towards Taiwan, towards Japan, in some cases off and on towards the United States. We also have seen, Deepa, how the Chinese have used forms of malign foreign meddling to insert themselves into our own politics in very nefarious ways. You know, the export of technologies that look private and commercial, but that enable surveillance and control. The kind of united front tactics and influence tactics that we have seen the Chinese deploy from Europe to Australia to Latin America to try to exert leverage over free countries, the kind of economic leverage that the Chinese have imposed through the Belt and Road and a set of very unequal infrastructure and other investments in often developing countries, where a country may think it's doing a commercial deal, but it turns out that it is then ceding a strategic harbor, a strategic port, or other national assets to China when it cannot handle burdensome debt terms. So, you know, I do think it's worth just staking out a little bit what the world would look like were it not governed by strong and cooperating free and open societies like the US and India and our core allies in Europe and Asia. So just to wrap up here, maybe it's obvious, a free and open Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific, which is what we all aspire to, in the US and India does require cooperation among free and open societies. We've seen a lot of that. The Indian government has leaned forward, as has the US government. That has happened across multiple administrations, starting with Bill Clinton and Prime Minister Vajpayee, and moving through our successive presidents. US-India relations improved under the Trump administration, which is not something we can say for every country, given some of that diplomacy. And they continue to improve. This recent summit of the Quad, which was our president's first heads of state summit, is very important in terms of the signal it sends. A senior official told me that countries all over Asia reached back after that summit and said, this is terrific. We see this as a really strong way, a platform to reinforce the free and open architecture that has enabled Asia's economic miracle, that has enabled relative peace to prevail in Asia since the end of the Vietnam War. So some of the other initiatives on pandemic response, obviously on connectivity to provide an alternative to Chinese forms of control. These are all very encouraging, and we see just a central role for India here in staking out really a different future for its wider region. And India, frankly, is an example of a country that can rise and prosper and flourish as a global power with free and open institutions. Finally, just for the last minute here, and I know we'll have more time to talk about this, neither the US nor India are perfect democracies. I mean, I don't think that's a newsflash. In America, as Alyssa suggests, we've been working on improving our democracy for 245 years now, and we still have work to do. That is no reason to stop trying, and that is no reason to somehow deter ourselves from working more closely together. You know, our view broadly, I think in the United States, is that improving and perfecting our democracy is of a piece with working with fellow democracies in the world on common challenges, right? We all face a common set of challenges. Lately, the pandemic, the dangers of techno-authoritarianism, inequality, and so many issues, environmental issues. Let's work together on them as free and open societies. And when we think about the future of our countries, including in this very tough international landscape, let's understand one central thing. And I think it's as important for India as it is for the United States, that it's our open systems, it's the integrity and quality of our institutions, of our democratic institutions, that those make us more competitive in the world. Those underwrite the kind of prosperity that we want to nurture. Those drive the kind of innovations that we know will transform our societies and the world. It's those open systems, the free and fair press, independent courts, regular electoral, obviously electoral integrity, and regular elections that allow people to choose their leaders. These are sources of strength. American leaders, Indian leaders are not afraid of their people. Leaders in Russia and China and elsewhere fundamentally are afraid of their own people, right? So let's double down on what makes us strong and resilient and robust, which is our democratic institutions. Those are actually our most important assets, even from a geopolitical competition lens. And I'm pretty confident that our open systems, if we can continue to secure and nurture them, will allow us to outperform and prevail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. This is a tough topic to tackle, and thank you for giving such a rousingly sophisticated and sensitive treatment of this. You have presented some stark choices that the world seems to be facing right now. And I'm just going to raise a couple of points. We will come back to that issues in final discussions. But let me just say a couple of things. One, you know, the stark choices are there, the shared values that drive some of our relationships. On the other hand, you know, shared values are kind of intangible, and we don't really sometimes know how valuable it is until we lose it. But that being said, often the statement in international relations is that countries have permanent interests, but no permanent friends and allies, right? And the corollary to that is that shared values don't always necessarily translate to shared interests. And so, but over these past several years, one thing I'm seeing is that the shared values themselves are influencing interests and how we see interests between India and the US. And so maybe there might be some, you know, extra power to those things in a new geopolitical environment. But I want to get your thoughts on that. But I'm going to have to move ahead and come back. And by the way, to the audience, let me just say that please don't wait until the end to put questions into the Q&A box, I guess. Please go ahead and do it right now if you can. All right, and I'll get to those when we are at that point. All right, thank you, Dan. And now, shifting to what is seen as a more hardcore counter to what we just heard, the idea of values, is security and strategy. And to tell us how defense and security in the Indo-Pacific is playing out in US-India relations is another distinguished analyst. He's going to, we have already heard a little bit about this from both Dan and Alyssa. He's going to elaborate on that. And this is Joshua White. who is the Associate Professor of Practice of South Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins University at the School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Josh brings a wealth of academic and policy experience, again, having served at the White House, at the National Security Council. He played an instrumental role in advancing U.S.-India relations, especially on defense and security cooperation, as well as trade and investment. He has been an advisor at the Office of Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon, and he has also been involved in the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, which is very, very central to the relationship of the two countries. He has a PhD from Johns Hopkins SAIS. So Josh, over to you to tell us even more about this partnership and how deep it is in the Indo-Pacific.
Terrific. Thank you so much. It's really delightful to be with all of you, and I'm grateful to you, Deepa and Alyssa, and being on this conversation with friends. And Father Joe's really so wonderful of you to host us, and I'm excited about the opportunity to meet some of your students face to face and hopefully continue these conversations in the future. I want to say just a few things about the defense and security relationship, a few preparatory remarks. The first is that the defense and security relationship is strong between India and the United States. I think there are a few underlying reasons for this. So part of it has to do with a lot of hard work by both governments over a long period of time. But if you think back to the George W. Bush administration and the effort by those in that administration to advance a civil nuclear deal between the two countries. The civil nuclear deal was not about defense, at least on the surface. It was about global cooperation. It was about civil nuclear energy. But the process of working through the civil nuclear deal and the partnership, the steps that it took to advance it, worked through a lot of resistance within the American security institutions. And it really brought about slowly but surely a shift in the mindset by many in Washington about the kind of partner that India could become on sensitive issues, on issues related to defense and security. The second foundational reason why this relationship is strong is that the U.S. and India share very similar views about the scourge of global terrorism, and very similar views about the roots and reasons behind that terrorism, and the role of not just Pakistan, but for India, a principal concern of Pakistan's unwillingness to address some of those root causes. So I think there's really a common shared perspective about the threats that the United States and India face from terrorism. And then third, there is a convergence of views about the threats that China might pose, particularly over the longer horizon, to free and open societies. And Dan addressed this so clearly and so eloquently. You know, the United States and India don't speak with the same kind of language about China. There's certainly a difference in the discourse, but I think that there is a common view of some of these broader concerns about China's ambitions on the global stage and what that will mean for the United States and India and for free and open societies, and also about India's approach to its borders. It's not the diplomatic way to say it, but India has been pretty sneaky on its borders, its continental borders with India, its maritime borders throughout Southeast Asia, and these are concerns that the U.S. and India share. So these are the roots of a strong relationship, and then there's been significant investment to make this relationship work in practice. There are a large number of defense exercises. As Alyssa mentioned, the U.S. government and the Indian government have worked closely to share technology at a level that the U.S. only does with its closest allies. We share intelligence. We have legal frameworks. We have regular defense meetings. India's bought a lot of U.S. equipment and sort of the training and sustainment that comes with that. So there's a great story to tell. If anything, I've argued that defense and security became too important in the U.S.-India relationship over the last 4 years in particular. And there was too much weight being put on this one dimension of what really, by rights, should be a much broader partnership given our shared values. And I think Alyssa and Dan both sort of mentioned this. It really is welcome that there is, I think, under this administration, in some ways, a rebroadening of the conversation to see defense and security as one piece of a wider relationship addressing things like climate change and clean energy and energy finance, certainly health security, technology, and the ways that technology are being used around the world. So I'm pleased that the relationship is strong in this area, but I think the fact that it's being situated as one element among many really reflects the kind of relationship that we can have. Now, I want to touch just very briefly on two opportunities in defense security, and I was going to have two, but I think it's actually 2.5 challenges that we face together. The first opportunity is in what my colleague and friend, Cara Abercrombie, who now works at the White House, has called building habits of cooperation together. The U.S. and India have put together, after 20 years of hard work, a set of agreements in place, legal agreements, on logistics and on intelligence and other areas that allow us to work together. And we built a set of exercises and meetings. And so we have the opportunity now to build these habits of actually doing things with the foundation that we have laid. 10 years ago, even, it was really politically impossible to talk about interoperability between our two militaries, our ability to operate together on land, in the air, on the seas. And now that's a common phrase, and it's a common practice. So from the sort of more benign activities like preparing for humanitarian disasters in the region, which are probably going to be increasingly frequent, to more sensitive activities like partnering together to track Chinese submarines in the Indian Ocean, we now have the agreements in place to really practice well and practice a lot. And I think that's a huge area of opportunity for us. The second area is to do a lot more on next generation technology. The old story was the Pentagon saying, India, please buy our stuff. And DRDO saying, Pentagon, please give us your best stuff. And neither of those conversations really are our countries operating at our best. I think we've learned a lot through some of it's been bumpy, but we've learned a lot about how to cooperate on defense technology. But there's a lot that we can do together on technology. And of course, Bangalore is really at the heart of a lot of this. But some of the brightest minds in the United States thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning have identified India as perhaps one of America's most important potential partners over the coming couple of decades, given its expertise and its scale. So on that front, we can be doing a lot. We can be working together on things that the United States is focusing on researching, advanced sensors, 3D printing for defense, all kinds of new technologies where we can work together to build the next great thing. Now, the U.S. doesn't operate like Russia, it doesn't operate like France. The U.S. government can't tell Boeing or Lockheed to do this with the Indians or give this to the Indians. So we have a different system, but our private sector is really strong and dynamic, and we can bring a lot to the table. And I think this is an area that actually can fit really well with the Prime Minister's Make in India initiative and the desire for India to build up its own indigenous base. So those are two opportunities. 2.5 challenges, and then I'll close. The first challenge is the way in which India builds its capabilities and military equipment. India has built what I call a motley or mixed force, in that it buys some planes from Russia and some from the United States and some from here and some from there. And that worked pretty well for the defense challenges of the last 30 years, but it's going to work poorly for the defense challenges of the next 30 years, when warfare is going to require that all of your stuff can talk to all of your other stuff. It's all networked together. This is what China is doing. This is what the United States is doing. And if India continues to purchase a little bit from here and a little bit from there and doesn't think ahead about how to connect it all together, that's really going to be a challenge, not only for India's defense, but for the ability of the United States to share some of the best stuff that we're doing with our friends in India. The second challenge is India, as scholars would say, India's constrained fiscal space, meaning there are not a lot of rupees to go around in the Indian budget, and India has huge needs, as all of you know. India needs to keep growing and growing more rapidly to have the budget space to invest in defense. This is something my friend Rick can talk about in a minute, but India has big challenges. It has to fund enough forces and capabilities to deal with two continental fronts, with China and Pakistan, to deal with a maritime front with the Indian Ocean, and also to think about how it expands its presence and reach into East Asia with its Act East policy. All that takes a lot of money, and in the absence of a lot of money, very, very difficult choices about what to do and what not to do. And I think that's going to be a challenge, not only for India, but for the U.S.-India relationship if India can't keep growing. The final thing I'll say, the half part of 2.5 gets to the theme that we've been discussing and that Dan talked about and Alyssa so clearly, is shared values. Shared values of democracy, the free press. You know, you could ask, well, why does it really matter for defense if we have shared values? You know, we both the United States and India have our shared worries about China. We have our shared worries about terrorism. Why does it matter if we have an alignment of values? And I do think it does matter for our defense partnership. It matters, you know, for our countries individually, because without open societies, we're not going to be as competitive as we can. We're not going to get the best people into our militaries. We're not going to have a diverse base of talent. So it matters for our own defense systems, but it also matters for the trust that we can build between our systems, between our institutions. And this is where I think it does make a big difference. I've seen firsthand how the United States military is willing to do all kinds of things and share all kinds of things with our friends in Australia because of not just the shared language, but our deep history and a very deep sense of trust with each other. And I think the shared values that we feel we share with India on democracy and these freedoms are tremendously important for building the trust between our two governments to do more things together. In the defense and security space, and to share more with each other. I would also say on this point that the feeling that exists in the U.S. Congress and among the U.S. people that India is a country and a people with shared values really shapes the willingness of the Congress and the administration of the United States to go out of its way to help India find an exceptional role on the world stage, whether that's in international institutions like the UN or the Nuclear Suppliers Group or other places. The US government will go out of its way to do things with and for India if it sees it as not just a friend, not just a partner with shared interests, but a country that at a deeper level shares some of the core values of a free and open society that are so important to many of us in the United States. So overall, this is a positive story, and I'm happy to talk more about it and answer questions. But those are a couple opportunities and 2.5 challenges to think about.
Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you for actually answering already some of the questions that have been coming up on the Q&A. One of them being extending Dan's and Alyssa's comments about shared values and worldviews, and adding, I suppose, a layer of what you've just said about strategic trust and the reason that it is important even in the arena of defense. I think that's something that's often missed in these conversations. So, whether or not defense is enough, that kind of transactional relationship, how do you move beyond that? And so thank you for adding that very important extra ingredient to the relationship. All right, I am mindful of the time, and so I'm going to keep going as rapidly as possible, and moving to, last but not least, to Rick Rossow on post-pandemic economics. We're trying to be optimistic here, post-pandemic. And the prospects, what are they for U.S.-India cooperation? And for this terrific speaker in Rick Rossow, I'm going to not be able to give you a big introduction, Rick, just to save time, but he is the Senior Advisor and Vadvani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies at CSIS. And his work really over a long period of time has been to promote greater business and economic engagement between India and the US, whether he was a CSIS or McClarty before that, and at the US-India Business Council that the Chargé d'Affaires mentioned in his statement today. He has expertise in a variety of areas that have been already mentioned, especially technology, energy, telecom sectors, and so forth. So, Rick, when you look ahead, beyond the pandemic, what do you see as some opportunities that are coming out of this, and some specific lessons maybe for moving ahead, cooperative in economics?
Thanks, Deepa. And let me share others in conveying too that my own thoughts and sympathies are with India as this crisis unfolds, and it's so good to see that the United States is waking up and looking for ways to support during this difficult period. I too, as Dan mentioned, want to get back on a plane because no place in the United States makes my Merg Makhni just the way that I like it. So need to get out there pretty soon and fill the tummy. Also, I think for the organizers too, to mention about taking the conversation outside Delhi really speaks to my heart. Those of you that know me and know my work, it's been very focused, in fact, on Indian states, because as you all know, in India, your development trajectory is going to be driven more by the things that are happening by your states rather than things in Delhi. So, expanding the number of folks that care and are interested in where this relationship's going is super crucial. So another reason I'm excited. And Christ University I've been to, it's such a gorgeous campus and a great student body there. Let me jump right into the content. I mean, I think looking briefly at pre-pandemic and during pandemic, and then post-pandemic, kind of these three phases of economic cooperation. Pre-pandemic was kind of a strange period where you actually had pretty good numbers showing that U.S.-India commercial relations were doing quite well. India had grown to be our 9th largest trading partner. India was attracting, record levels of foreign direct investment, a lot of investment from India coming back to the United States. But at the same time, I think that the two governments were active in a pretty intense trade war. We saw a number of actions really since the Modi government came to office, where you began to see a lot of protectionism. Certainly when President Trump was elected and taking on protectionism any place that he saw it, India presented a pretty strong target. So even though the two leaders seemed to have a fairly decent relationship between themselves, you really saw trade relations as driven by our governments, just one bad day after another. India taking a lot of steps either against the world on trying to close the borders to trade or specifically against the United States. And the United States reciprocating in full, most notably the United States revoking India's generalized system of preferences, trade package, and a whole bunch of other steps that kind of led to it. So good numbers, but pretty bad sentiments. I think domestically, we saw that the U.S. companies that care about India as an investment destination too began to lose interest to some extent because the Modi government, I think, late in its first term and certainly in the first year of its second term, had really lost a lot of its momentum on major reforms. When he first came to office and you saw goods and services tax, you saw bankruptcy reform, you saw oil and gas reforms, and a slew of other things. That whole process of major domestic reforms and foreign investment reforms had really kind of teetered off about a little after halfway through his first term and hadn't been triggered again. So, the two governments focused a lot of their more positive efforts on trying to secure a mini trade agreement to remove some of these impediments, but were unsuccessful. During the pandemic, for the most part, things got dramatically worse, at least initially. Bilateral goods trade sunk. India fell from our 9th largest trading partner to our 11th. China actually surpassed the United States as India's top goods trading partner. Foreign portfolio investors, those passive investments that buffer up India's stock market, had dramatic outflows, 18 billion of outflows in that passive investment during the first 2 months of the pandemic a year ago. Services trade remained strong. You saw a lot of, and again, very central to Bangalore's life, you saw a lot of these technology majors that really, at the end of the day, forget defense trade, forget anything else. IT service still remains the bedrock of U.S.-India commercial relations. Most U.S. companies that have any presence in India, is focused on IT services and all the many wonderful things that have kind of flown from that. And that was a lot more solid. A lot of these companies had to send employees home with a laptop and tell them to work from home, and still continue to do so at the day. But they had to, because a lot of the U.S. healthcare, a lot of the U.S. financial system relies on Bangalore, relies on Hyderabad, relies on Gurgaon to keep those things afloat. And so, even though India's goods trade took a hit, foreign portfolio investment took a hit, services trade, India's IT services trade remained really kind of a bedrock. But, unfortunately, as we're all kind of seeing, that also kind of accentuates the haves versus the have-nots. Those that can get a laptop and go home and do their work versus working a construction site and such. So good to keep inflows, not so good as a reflection of the wider economy per se. The one area, though, that remained strong all throughout the pandemic is foreign direct investment. India, which had been averaging under Modi $40–50 billion annually in FDI, spiked to $65 billion in foreign direct investment. A big chunk of that was some individual placements by U.S. investors in Reliance Jio, but that's only less than about 10% of the total FDI inflows. So even though other markets were having problems, India was having problems, a lot of U.S. foreign investors had felt that the market promise of India's opportunity, was so strong that even in the middle of the crisis, India continues to hit all-time record numbers on foreign direct investment. So certainly there's some bright spots. Now, I'd say after a couple of months of the crisis, I think the Modi government really, in a lot of ways, got its mojo back on major domestic reforms and even foreign direct investment related reforms. You saw a major ports bill move, you saw a tax cut, you saw really tough foreign investment changes in more sensitive areas like defense and insurance, which have been sitting for a long time, to allow foreign companies in both of those sectors to own a majority stake. So a lot of really significant domestic investments, even the farm laws. I mean, I know they're very contentious, but ultimately, farmers that want to modernize now have a lot more freedom to be able to do so. Again, there will be some difficulties. Some farmers that can't modernize are going to be left behind. So it's not to say that some of the problems that protesters have raised about the farm bills are problematic. But long term, to try to get agriculture to be more productive, to have larger land holding, to sell to who they want to, if you go through and I've poured through the reforms on the farm bills, a lot of farmers that want to grow are going to be able to, where they were essentially banned from growing, at the rate they'd want to before. So I think the Modi government, COVID, has kind of shook it to, refocus considerably on some major reforms. Now, post-pandemic, and let's get to the important sections of the topic that Deepa had asked me to raise. When we think about the commercial relationship, there's really two emerging angles for it. You've got the purely commercial. What decisions are the private sector going to make? What issues do they care about? And where are they going to take the relationship if allowed? And then you've got strategic commercial issues. Those where the governments do play a big role. Josh rightly mentioned that there's only certain functions the United States government can control when you talk about even on defense commercial relations, because a lot of it's in the private sector. But so you've got pure play commercial, and then you've got the strategic commercial. And I think the two are headed in very different directions right now. And I hope that won't be the case long term, but right now it is. Pure play commercial issues, look, both governments remain very protectionist. Biden hadn't shown any interest in rolling back a lot of the protectionist things that Trump had been doing yet. Modi, the budget that was just released, you saw customs duties increase. You've seen, kind of doubling down on local content rules for a lot of sectors. So I think that, the difficulty in our commercial relationship is going to be maintained. Both countries, failing to try to find a pathway out of these economic doldrums driven by COVID, opening up more fully to trade doesn't seem to be on the lips of either country. So I think that the tensions are going to remain. Even on services looking ahead, there's some trouble, I think, that kind of sits out there on the horizon. India has been slowly building out data localization rules. And again, thinking about IT services trade as the bedrock of U.S.-India commercial relations, if India takes a step that potentially limits data flows in a more significant way, then a lot of U.S. companies, when they think about the additional cost and complexity about managing data flows between the United States and India, They may choose to go with, Vietnam, Philippines. There's a lot of countries that are chomping at India's heels to get a larger slice of this really lucrative IT services trade market. And in fact, there are even alternatives. When IT services took off, of course, there was a lot of call centers and such, but now some of that can be managed by, AI programs and such. So, they may choose to go without humans on the other side for some of these functions overall. So I think we've got some difficulties in the water when we think about pure play in terms of the things that governments may be looking at. On the positive side, the markets for both countries are so large and so important that, even though you may see continued tensions between our governments, and I suspect you will, I don't think that you're going to see a huge hit to cross-border trade and investment. Indian companies look at the United States as one of the first places to invest. American companies thinking of India for the market, not necessarily for global production, but at least for tapping into the domestic market. So I suspect the numbers will continue to be pretty good, even if tensions between the governments remain. Now, on the flip side, the more positive side is strategic commercial. These are the areas where the governments are thinking more positively, thinking about ways that the United States and India can collaborate. You saw a lot of that listed out, I think, in the joint statement after the Leader Summit of the Quad meeting. As Josh and others know well, 5G was probably one of the first, of these commercial topics that was brought more fully into the strategic realm, trying to convince other countries to avoid, buying Chinese equipment because of the security threats there. And there's a whole range of things. Frankly, if you haven't studied the Made in China 2025 plan, which, the Chinese government has tried to walk away from somewhat, but if you look at all the technologies where China has put on paper that they want to dominate global manufacturing and production flows, that's the agenda. Every single thing on there is what they're trying to take away from our potential manufacturing bases. And we know that China doesn't play fair in these areas. If it was pure play commercial and it was fully private companies with no government support that were looking to be, really effective in these spaces, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But we know that's not the game that China plays. So, what can we do lashing our economies together, setting up rules of the road for the import of this kind of equipment, so that it won't impose, such strong security problems. I would say information security, is another area that kind of falls in that. India banning Chinese apps, imposing new restrictions on Chinese investment, the United States considering the same. We're both moving simultaneously in kind of the same direction, but not cooperating as well as we could in terms of raising concerns about information security. Can the United States and India set up rules of the road for when data-centric companies, get to invest, get to take data, get to send it back home? Can we develop, common criteria and potentially common penalties if we find that countries are using this for malevolent purposes? We have to get it right. Companies have their knives out towards India right now across Washington, D.C. Companies that see themselves losing market access, they are helping drive some of the narrative about how Washington looks at India right now. And it's not just simply trade repercussions, but when we think about trying to avoid, this coming fireball headed right at our heads, the CAATSA sanctions that could be applied against India. Members of Congress, a lot of members of Congress, the last constituent they heard from was a company that felt that they lost a bit of market access because some of these protectionist things that have happened in India. So we got to get it right. Companies can be a huge ally and really support the relationship. They can also be one of the most difficult challenges in trying to avoid, kind of missteps from the United States administration too. So Deepa, I'll leave it at that, kind of the positives and the negatives that I see right now, and I hope there's some good questions there. But thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Rick, for laying out the bilateral relationship as well as bringing in the multilateral Quad component as well. And I would have liked to have heard maybe more on supply chain resilience, cooperation, and so forth. But in the interest of time, let me just move ahead now. It's time to invite my two colleagues from Christ University, Professors Madhumati Deshpande and Professor Manoharan, for their comments and raise additional questions, I assume. Madhumati is the department coordinator and head of department. She has been an avid publisher in a variety of topics, including foreign policy analysis and political theory. She has been a resident at the Carter Center in Atlanta, observing elections, and she holds a PhD from JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. And I'm going to also introduce Professor Manoharan that you first met when at the beginning, at the top of the program. He's an associate professor in the Department of International Studies, Political Science, and History. And until recently, he was also at the National Security Council Secretariat, the Prime Minister's Office, the Ministry of Defense in New Delhi. He's been in Washington as a visiting fellow at the East-West Center, and he also is a prolific writer, including a new book that's coming out on federal aspects of foreign policy. He too holds a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. So I'd ask Professor Madhumati to please begin.
Yes, thank you, Deepa. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for your insights on US-India relations. And it's been a really eye-opener for us to listen to the practitioners as well as the academics, because it is you who have made the Indo-US relations come as far as they have come today. So thank you for all of those comments and your speeches. Respected Father Jose and my colleagues and students, my comments, I'm going to limit my comments in light of the timing that we have today. My main comments, and this is based on my conversations with the students as a teacher, I'm going to make myself an academician and not an observer or a practitioner of this here, because I answer the next generation of students who are looking at this Indo-US relations, and they question the shared values that we talked about today. For them, it is what is happening currently and not what you share. Yes, you may have shared a lot of things together, and we see that, you know, when you look at Indian foreign policy or US foreign policy, we talk about Indo-US relations. You go back all the way and you say, yes, they had the shared values. Both of them have been democracies. They talk about this, but how is it that United States has completely different interests when it comes to either helping India or being in the Asian region? Initially, it was Pakistan, then the shift towards China, and then finally, they finally saw that India is, you know, making headway and the biggest population that they can support. They sided with United States. And these are the questions that I face in an everyday in my classes from the next generation of Indians who are taking this US-India relations forward. So for them, apart from the shared values, what are those things that the United States expects India to do to become the allies that they had been hoping for, not as a military partner, but as a companion in the Asian region, and recognizing India as a rising power, and becoming a partner of India to take it as the leader in the area, and cooperate in defense, in economy, in strategic policies, all of these together. What is it that India has to do for United States to, again, bringing back the trust point here, what do we have to do to bring that trust? I understand about democracy. And then, I mean, of course, as everybody has pointed out, that, you know, both our democracies have seen ups and downs, especially in the recent past. And both of us are learning go through with that democracy. And both United States and India have seen that our institutions have gone, have shown some kind of resilience, even in spite of the, a little bit of autocratic rule on both the countries. But it's the continuation of that shared value. What do we have to do? Do we have to, and does United States see India as the leader of democracy in Asia? Because the Middle East is not as democratic as you would like it to be. The Southeast Asian countries are not as democratic. The Central Asian countries are not as democratic. So it's only India, which looks a little bit more democratic than anybody else. So is there anything more that needs to be done for India to become the partner? Is the question that I get asked most often in my class. So I think I would like to ask Joshua White to comment on it. I know Daniel also probably would like to comment on the same.
Okay, what I'm going to do is invite Professor Manoharan now. And by the way, I'm going to, with the permission of the panelists, I'm taking the prerogative to extend our discussion a few more minutes because we're clearly running out of time. The good news is that many of the questions that I've raised and Madhumati just raised are the ones that are coming in the Q&A. So Manohar, thank you very much, Madhumati, for raising those excellent questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Deepa. Greetings to all. I've been tasked to reflect on points raised by Dr. Joshua and Dr. Rick. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep it as brief as possible. At the outset, deeply appreciate panelists for highlighting key pointers in an objective manner. This is worth appreciating, that are worth reflecting and worth taking forward. So thanks, panelists, for that. Glad to know and agree that India and US are key powers in Indo-Pacific region. Shared views like security, democracy, interoperability, HDR, and so on and on, which the panelists raised and keynote remarks raised. Happy to note that US is going out of its way to help India, which is the latest help shows that. We are very glad about that, and heartening also to hear that there is a lot of positivity, which is really, really appreciable. But I'm more concerned with shared worldviews, but differing interests. Shared worldviews, I repeat, but there are differing interests. This is where the problems coming, which even Josh said that 2.5 kind of challenges that he pointed out in a framework. Let me identify a few issues. These are my personal views. Those reflect neither the Christ University nor India. So the first thought that comes to our mind in India is continuities and changes due to regime changes. This we frequently see as and when regime changes. So sometimes they hug and sometimes they just say hi. So this is something, how to handle this tectonic shifts to give stability to the bilateral ties in the long run is something we need to think about. We are also deeply impressed by the systems in place in the United States. This I'm speaking from my personal point of view. I'm sure Dr. Madhumati also lived there. So we have been there and we lived there. The kind of infrastructure. What is the level and inclination of the involvement in infrastructure development in India and its neighborhood? Because we see Chinese and Japanese around in India and the neighborhood, and we don't see US much. So this is a good means to get into heart of the people. So this is something we can always explore. Then something about regional trade and connectivity. We hear a lot about the concerns about the BRI. We both countries share about it. We have now something called Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. How serious is the United States in this alternate BRI? What is the commitment that the United States is giving on this particular alternate BRI? Then it's glad that reaping benefits of Indo-Pacific region that involves actually stability of two key regions in this. Means West Asia and South and East Asia. These are very important. Stability of these two regions, sub-regions are very important to stabilize Indo-Pacific region. And I think we need to work more on this. And I think we need to see more or share views on this particular stability. Glad to note also that defense relations are going strong and strong. This has been for decades. Joint military exercise have been there. This is indeed appreciable. But the point is, when the defense sector in India is opening up for private sector, are there any still hitches in a comprehensive defense cooperation is what the questions that occurs always in our mind. So in that sense, how are we going to move forward, especially on technology transfer? This is a hitch, a traditional hitch that we are facing, especially when Josh raised these emerging threats and nature of warfare. So this is something we need to work on. Then taking on Josh's point itself, shared perspective on terrorism. But there is a problem here. So are we sharing in every sense? Is there a shared view on every sense? We are sharing on effect in the sense the effect on terrorism, but are we sharing views on the cause? So this is time and again we baffle the way Pakistan is handled by the United States. Then Rick pointed about the protectionism in commercial relations. This is a very good point he raised. This is a key issue that needs to be addressed on an urgent basis. In this sense, can we, academia or academicians, play any key role in throwing some creative options on the table? Is something because we are all as much objective as possible on this particular issue. Few other issues. One is civil aviation is yet another shared view that we have, but with a lot of potential. But we see issues in safety standards. How should we go about on this? Would you be in a position, I mean here, United States be in a position to help Indian aviation sector on training, especially something we can reflect on? And all of the global commons is the issues emerging out of climate change. There is a shared worldview on this, but in terms of the mitigation, how should we go about? I think we can work better on having common ground. And one potential meeting ground could be in cooperation in gas-based or renewable energy or clean energy. Any thoughts on various aspects of cooperation would also be benefit. And I think we need to push further on that. In the light of ongoing pandemic, health sector is emerging. We thought that India's health sector was good, but the way the second wave has exposed that. But still, can we push ourselves on medical technology, telemedicine, diagnostics, pharma, all those things, especially the export of raw materials that got hitched in terms of for the Covishield. And of course, we found a way around, but still, you know what the reality was. This required a lot of push. So in short, these are the various issues. I can go on in raising certain issues. But in short, my observation is there are shared worldviews, but the convergence requires shared platforms and shared lenses. This is where it is. This is exactly what we need to work on as both the countries, including academia. Thank you all for your patient listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Manohar. I think Madhumati and Manohar have raised enough questions for another conference to be held. But what the good point is that they have raised almost the questions that I'm seeing coming through in the chat boxes. And in it is the question of values and shared values and worldviews and how that cuts through economics, defense, and security in both bilateral and multilateral, and how so there are clashes in each of these, but also convergences. And I'm going to start for comments the way we began. I'm going to start with Dan because the worldviews and values just run right through every single issue so far. So Dan, and then Josh and Rick, please.
Deep, I've really enjoyed the different perspectives and also just watching the chat. I mean, a couple things. One is no two democracies are the same. I think we just have to distinguish, as several of our colleagues did, between fundamentally an open society and one that is a control society. And an open society looks like all of us who live in democracies, and a control society looks like China. Martin Wolf, the distinguished economic commentator, had a super piece in the Financial Times this week saying China's making a mistake in underestimating American decline. Partly because of the inherent strengths of US innovation, entrepreneurship, venture capitalism, all those legacy advantages that continue to accrue. But also fundamentally, he was making a point about China, that there's no way 1.4 billion intelligent and creative people can have their lives controlled by one party that's run by one man, that is just not an effective model to seed innovation and dynamism in the 21st century. And so I'll go back to something I said. I think the way for India and America to be competitive is to double down on our democratic strengths and not to let those erode. That the work of democracy is something we all have to do every day. And by the way, a lot of the work in a democracy is done by citizens. It's not done by governments. Democracy is not about the leader. Democracy is about the people, and it's about clean and effective and accountable and responsive institutions. And it's about an ecosystem that includes free and open media, that includes independent courts, that includes the full rights of civic association, that includes protection of minority rights. And yes, we have problems with these in both of our countries, but they don't look like the concentration camps in Xinjiang. They don't look like the tear gassing of peaceful demonstrators in Hong Kong and the brutal repression of activists, the brutal repression. So I do think we have to fundamentally distinguish, and we have to recommit ourselves to making our democracies more inclusive and more accountable and more just. And that cuts across all lines. I mean, Deepa, just to finish with something you said in your comments, I think it's a false distinction, this idea that countries have interests and then they have values, and these are two different things. In America, we define our foreign policy interests with respect to our belief in democratic alliances, with respect to our belief in a free and open and rules-based international economy, with respect to our opposition to countries invading their neighbors by force, which Russia just threatened again to do in Ukraine last week, right? Which China threatened to do to India in the north quite recently. We are against that. And that's because of who we are as a democratic society. And that we need to be bound by rules, and we need to endeavor for peaceful and just outcomes. And control societies, autocracies, dictatorships fundamentally have a different take. And if this Chinese vision prevails, it's not just a question of who's going to control the sea lanes, or what is the trade balance going to be. Those are secondary questions. The foundational issue is that the free and open way of life that Indians and Americans want to lead will become harder and harder to sustain in a world in which we are not working together very strongly to sustain global public goods and to sustain a free and open order.
Thank you so much for that vigorous and persuasive defense of values. And now to Josh.
I think we all aspire to be as vigorous as Dan. You know, I do get and I do appreciate this question that Deepa, you raised and some in the chat have raised. Well, what does the U.S. want from India, right? And in some ways, it's an understandable question. There are things the U.S. wants from India. On the defense and technology side, we'd like India to buy more of our stuff, more of our equipment, for sure. We would like policy stability. You know, we'd like India to stop changing the defense procurement procedure like every year. There are certainly things that the United States wants, but in some ways, it's not the right question. I think there's a deeper assumption that runs through the U.S. re-engagement with India over the last 20 years, which is that a strong India, an India that is a preponderant power in its neighborhood and beyond, is going to be good for the United States. That the specifics of what we get and what India gets are less important than the idea that a strong India that reflects these democratic values within its own society and operates that way is going to provide some balance in Asia in a way that that makes less likely the kind of growing Chinese power and influence and some of its pernicious effects that Dan has talked about. So I think that's a deeper view here in Washington. And second, and a little bit more on the friendly note, the United States also wants a partner. You know, these last couple of years have reinforced to all of us the world is an unpredictable place. We don't know what is coming. We don't know what challenges that we're going to have to face. And so we're not going to see eye to eye with India on everything, but a country that we can, a partner we can engage with on questions from disinformation, technology, global health and pandemics, dealing with climate change in creative ways, figuring out, well, okay, if India can't make these certain commitments, can we help with financing? You know, being able to have those open conversations and deal with a world that is changing and unpredictable. You know, on the defense side, nobody really predicted the way in which China was going to be aggressive and coercive along India's border in the way that it has. Situation in Afghanistan changing, and we can't see the future. And so I think the desire in Washington to say, look, there are things we want that we won't always get. There are things India wants it won't always get. But can we have a partner to work on the global stage to address what's going to come our way? That I think is the deeper impulse, and one that has animated Republicans and Democrats in the United States to continue investing in this relationship. But as Dan said, it is enabled in many ways and in many times by that sense of we're in this together with a shared sense of the sort of open society that we want to have. And so I think that remains foundational to the sense of trust that's required to build that kind of partnership.
Thank you for that terrific response, Josh. And your thoughts, Rick?
Yeah, I think among all the questions posed, there's a couple on infrastructure, renewable energy, and academics, what they can do on trade. Those are three things I'll touch on. So on the infrastructure side, you know, frankly, India's infrastructure sector overall, it's so non-transparent. It's so difficult to get involved in that, you know, U.S. commercial entities, for the most part, have tended to avoid. Now, first, you have to kind of take a step back. What does infrastructure investment look like, right? It's primarily driven by pension companies and life insurance companies, primarily investments that are placed in secure tools, you know, like bonds. And as you know, India's bond market is really underdeveloped. The consistency of payment streams for infrastructure, you know, is tricky. And then, of course, the whole thing about getting involved and actually making those investments in infrastructure in India is a really non-transparent thing. So, you know, for the private sector, they've taken some small nuggets, you know, like a lot of U.S. consultancies are advising state governments in India on the Smart Cities program, or the Bechtels and other engineering firms will look for contracts. But actually being owner and operator of infrastructure it's a difficult, dangerous business in India still. So it's mostly scared away, I think, a lot of U.S. companies that otherwise might consider. Now, the upside, is the United States, has recast its Overseas Private Investment Corporation, now the Development Finance Corporation. They have an office in Mumbai. They got a staffer there. They're rolling out billions of dollars in local investments. So you do see for the first time, really kind of a substantial stake, from the U.S. federal government in making infrastructure investments in India. It's small, but it's growing fast. It's a relatively new organization. It's got new money. It's got new authority on the kinds of investments it can make. So kind of watch that space. That's, I think, the area where you're going to see probably the most growth in the interim. I do think, though, as I mentioned, the Quad, it was glaringly absent the fact that they didn't talk about, the four countries collaborating on infrastructure investments across the region. When we think about China's inroads into the Indian Ocean region, it is not, at least today, Chinese military. You do have a more active presence of the PLA Navy, but it's still relatively modest compared to India and others in the region. You see China investing first in strategic infrastructure, ports, trying to buy an island in Maldives, some of these steps that they took or have attempted to take. So I think better collaboration across the region is pretty important. You do run across one of the same problems I mentioned before, which is a lot of these markets, as tough as India is for an American company or even the US federal government to consider making infrastructure investments, most of the countries we're talking about, the markets are even less developed. So having the legal infrastructure, having the financial architecture to be able to accommodate these kind of investments in an open, transparent way, it's just not really there. So the United States has announced this Blue Dot Network. I don't know yet what's going to happen with that. But basically the government would bless certain projects and say that they're commercially viable. And that was meant to be kind of a note to the private sector that, go in and take a look, because otherwise the private sector may not, have somebody out there in Maldives kicking around a project to see whether it's kind of investment worthy or not. So some format of that, where the countries work together. But ultimately, a U.S. company balance sheet does not have a notation in there for voting against Taiwan at the UN or something. And that's what China's balance sheet has got on it. So some of these projects, we're simply not going to be able to compete for, because the way that we look at the effectiveness of the investments is so very different. What I mentioned about India's domestic environment too, I should mention, the question was brought up on renewable energy. The same thing applies there. I mean, if you look at the massive amounts of arrears that are owed to India's large domestic renewable energy companies, it's a scary situation. Now you do have, passive investors like Goldman and others that have put placements in some of India's renewable energy developers. But as of right now, payments are 6 months, 9 months, a year late. Sometimes they're shortchanged quite a bit. So I think until India's distribution companies get a little bit stronger, it's going to be tougher to see a bigger flow of U.S. investment into India's renewables market, despite these big targets. And it's also going to be an area of real tension. And this is going to be interesting to see how the Biden administration sort of squares the circle. We want to see India make bigger commitments on things that are going to help climate change, renewable energy, electric vehicles, things like that. I can tell you that I spend most of my day engaging India federal government and state government on these renewable and electric vehicle commitments. It is driven first and foremost, and by a huge margin, by the desire to create local manufacturing in these sectors. Indian voters do not care about climate change. They do not. And if anybody on this call tells me they do, I will point to a dozen chief ministers I've talked to in the last 2 months and say, there is no signal from voters that air quality or climate change is meaningful to voters. So when you see electric vehicle policies, when you see renewable energy, it's primarily trying to attract investments in those areas and increase jobs in those areas. Now, that also means that it's going to cause a lot more tension with the Biden administration. They want climate change goals, but they also don't want to see local manufacturing rules. You've seen successive governments going back to Obama challenging India on these climate change commitments when they've got local manufacturing jobs, kind of as part and parcel. So that's going to be tension, I think. I think the two agree on climate change is a priority, the two leaders. But how we get there is going to be a little bit tricky. The last thing I'll mention quickly, Deepa, the question about how academics can maybe help to move the needle a little bit on trade and some of these tensions. The biggest thing I would say, the biggest gap that I think still exists, is are state governments really getting things right? State governments across India, they're just not held to account. There's little transparency in what they're doing. And if we talk about India's competitiveness as a manufacturing place and their ability to compete on trade, most of those decisions, frankly, lie with state governments more so than they do from Delhi. And so continuing to hold states accountable for getting things right, for improving the business environment, for noting what one state did that another state could do, that's like, I'd say, the area that there hasn't been nearly enough quality work done, and I'm guilty for that, as we all are. So getting states to get things right, I think, is the key to India being a stronger manufacturing powerhouse, and building enough domestic competency where there are not going to be these pressures against trade, because India is going to have an export surplus. So that's probably the one area, I'd say, on the academic front that more work could be done. And Christ has always been such a leader in so many ways that I'm sure you'll take that up and continue great work there.
Thank you so much. I want to just say that we have been racing across the finish line right now, and I want to first of all thank everyone for their patience with going over time. Everybody is super busy, I know, and other issues going on. But I wanted to say that before we bring this incredibly stimulating conference and thought-provoking comments that people have made, I have learned a lot. I hope the students and audience have as well. We will be having a few more of these events in the future, fingers crossed, in person, and we will be in touch. We'll also have a survey that will be actually in the chat box, but also I would urge everyone that attended to please provide some feedback for that. And even though we didn't get to every single question, we actually miraculously covered quite a lot because they overlap so much with the questions that were raised during the conference. And so let me now turn to Professor Vagheswari, who will give a formal vote of thanks and will close the conference. Thanks again from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Deepa. Greetings to one and all. I believe post-colonial scholars ranging from Edward Said to Gayatri Spivak consistently argued that one cannot refuse to represent the cultural other. So much so Gayatri Spivak went to the extent of saying that there is something called a strategic essentialism in post-colonial studies, which argued that the viewpoint of the other need to be constantly looked into. So perhaps the entire essence of the conference that we had today represents our post-colonial initiatives and our post-colonial orientation. And I agree with Professor Deepa Ollapally, who said that this was a very stimulating exercise and a stimulating initiative. So on behalf of the Department of International Studies, Political Science and History, as well as on behalf of Christ University, I extend a very warm thanks to the moderator of the entire session, Professor Deepa Ollapally, for also taking the initiative for Rising Powers Conference. Thank you very much, Deepa. Our thanks also on behalf of both the organizing committees. Our thanks also are to Mr. Donald L. Heflin, who was the charge d'affaires, for his very considerate message, which set the tone for the entire conference. Our two keynote speakers, Dr. Father Joe Sese, who is also the director of the department in the campus, as well as a very important scholar who has done who has very deep insights regarding maritime trade and the India-European interactions, etc. He set the pace for the entire conference by contextualizing the whole initiative itself. And our thanks also to Professor Alyssa Ayres for the keynote address that she delivered, where the Indo-US relationship from domestic policy to external affairs was put into a nutshell or framework. So both of you, please be kind enough to accept our thanks and our gratitude. The panelists, consisting of Daniel Twining, Joshua White, and Richard M. Rosso, they contextualized how exactly the choppy waters of international commerce, trade, defense, technology needs to be navigated. And this navigation cannot be isolated or cannot be insulated from a certain value. It has to be contextualized within the values of transparent negotiations and transparent and more consensual relationships. So on behalf of the organizers, on behalf of the department and the university, I also extend our warm regards to all the three panelists. Thank you very much. My colleagues, Dr. Madhumati and Manoharan, They literally represented us in terms of all the discussions that we have been having with our stakeholders, with our students, and the very heated arguments that emerged in the department regarding Indo-US relationship. They were looking at the next generation of whom we hope to formulate as policymakers, who would be perhaps one day sitting on the chairs and trying to negotiate the bilateral relationship. Both Manoharan and Madhumati raised very valid concerns where we need to look at our students' concerns in terms of Enron, in terms of Union Carbide, in terms of what all happened, both the past, the present, as well as the future. So my thanks, my very affectionate and personal thanks to them too. We also have a number of invitees. We have scholars from all over the world. We have interested participants who enriched our thinking and our exchanges, our engagements through the questions that they raised. And as Deepa Ollapally was saying, we hope to continue to have these conversations in many more such sessions. Thank you very much for your patient listening and for being a part of our engagement. Have a pleasant night, a pleasant evening, and a pleasant day to all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Once again, I thank all the panelists, keynote speakers, and all the participants who have stayed on. I know we couldn't address all the questions, but you know that we will share the contact details. You can just get in touch. And this is, as Professor Deepa said, this is just the beginning. We will have more such events. You are most welcome. There is query about participation certificate. As promised, we will be mailing you the participation certificates. And once again, we request to participate in the survey. Please turn in. This is going to be very important feedback for us, how we should take forward the initiative. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Have a nice day. You may sign off. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.